Hi there, Gigi from the RBA. In this video, we're going to talk about reading and interpreting charts. Visualizing data using charts is an important medium of communication for economists. But charts are not only a useful tool for economists, they're used in many other professions that rely on data as well. What this means is that chart literacy is really important. You're going to see charts everywhere in your study of economics and also in your general life. Maybe some of you have seen the evening news on ABC. The finance section is presented by a guy called Alan Kohler, who makes really great use of charts to present the news. The great thing about charts, which you'll also see labelled as graphs in RBA publications, is that they can convey a lot of information really efficiently. Let's take a look at this data on the number of teenagers employed full-time in Australia. The data on this slide runs from 1978 to 84 and it's split by gender. Looking at the raw data, it's very difficult to sort of discern anything from it. But we can turn this data into a chart, which looks like this. Now it's much easier to very quickly make several inferences from the data. For example, it seems that there's always more male teenagers employed full-time than females over the history of the series. And another observation we could make is that the number of teenagers in full-time employment has fallen over the past 30 years, and this fall was particularly sharp in the early 1990s. Even the time it took me to say all that is much longer than it took your mind to process this information from the chart. So you can see how charts at the same time can be very efficient and also very powerful. The other benefit of charts is that they're an engaging visual aid. At the RBA, we try and use charts in our presentations as much as possible. You might have noticed this if you've ever seen a speech by a senior member of the RBA or a presentation from one of our ambassadors. Your audience can digest charts quickly, and this allows them to focus on what you're saying rather than trying to read a lot of words on a slide. I encourage you to be as visual as possible in your own presentations. In this video, I'm going to show you all of the things that you typically find on a chart. To do this, we'll return to our previous chart on teenagers in full-time employment. What are the key parts of this chart? Well, first we have the title, which usually summarizes what the chart is showing. The title's typically short and doesn't tell us that much about the data. Its purpose is simply to draw us in. Next, we'll talk about the axes, which are the information along the vertical and horizontal edges of the chart. This is the x-axis along the horizontal and the y-axis on the vertical. In this chart, the y-axes are the same on the left and right-hand sides of the chart, but this doesn't always have to be the case, so watch out for this. The x-axis is usually the place where we can find out what type of data we're dealing with. For example, the x-axis on this chart clearly displays time. When this is the case, it usually means that we're dealing with a type of data called time series data. Time series data is just a sequence of observations of the same thing organized in order over time. For instance, on this chart, we're looking at the same thing, which is the number of teenagers employed full-time, every month, and seeing how much that thing changes as time passes. Often a time series of a variable is simply called a series for short. So we figured out that one dimension of our data is time. The other dimension of our data is shown on the y-axis. At the top of the y-axis, the units of the data are shown, which helps us to figure out how our data is represented. The units on this chart are thousands, which means we're looking at thousands of teenagers employed full-time. The scale of the y-axis refers to the range of values that it covers. The scale here is between 0 and 400,000. The increments of the y-axis are the amounts that the scale increases by. On our chart here, the increment is 100,000. Next, we'll look at the subtitle. Information that usually goes in the subtitle could be the type of data that's shown, the frequency of the data, or any transformations that have been made to the data. This information is put just below the title because it's necessary for the viewer to know this information to interpret the chart. For instance, in our chart we have the subtitle monthly seasonally adjusted. This tells us that the data measures the number of teenagers employed every month. Seasonally adjusted refers to a transformation that's been made to the data. I'll explain what this is because you're likely to see it in a lot of RBA charts. So seasonal patterns are fluctuations to the data that tend to happen in a regular cycle. A good example might be the increase in spending on sunscreen that occurs every summer compared to other times of the year. Seasonal adjustment removes these regular fluctuations, which can sometimes make it difficult for us to see trends in the data and to compare the data throughout the year. So if we look at the data when they're not seasonally adjusted, this is what we would have. And you can see that there's a spike in the data every year, which is usually in the months from December to February. This spike makes it harder for us to interpret short-term movements in the data. Can anybody guess why this spike might have occurred? Exactly, it's the Christmas school holidays. Some teenagers may take up full-time employment during the Christmas school holidays, particularly in industries like retail and hospitality. So back to our original chart, the next thing I want to talk about are the labels, which are usually in the body or panel of the chart. Labels help us distinguish the different series drawn on the chart. Here it helps us show that the data is split by gender. Now labels are flexible because you can place them anywhere on the chart. However, some people prefer a legend, which looks like this. So finally, let's look at the information at the bottom of the chart. So you might notice in the title there's an asterisk at the end. This directs our attention to a footnote at the bottom of the chart. Footnotes are used to provide extra information, which is useful for the viewer but not strictly necessary to understand the chart. For example, the footnote on this chart gives a definition of teenagers, but we probably would have guessed what that was anyway. Think of footnotes like a frequently asked questions part of the chart. If you need any more information or have any questions about the data, chances are they'll be covered in a footnote. And finally, we'll talk about the source notes. The source notes tell you where the data come from. In this instance, the data come from the ABS, or Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is one of the main providers of economic data in Australia. The source notes are useful if you wanted to find the data for yourself. For example, you could find the data on this chart on the ABS's website. So in summary, the main parts of a chart that we discussed are the title, the X and Y axes, the units, the subtitle, the panels, the labels, the footnotes, and the sources. So that's all I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, I'll run through in some detail some charts from the RBA's monthly chart pack. See you next time.